I never thought a simple neighborhood could become a battlefield. But that all changed the day Karen moved in. The new HOA enforcer with a perfect smile and eyes that seemed harmless until they weren't. And from the moment she stepped onto our quiet street, I felt a chill that I couldn't explain, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon. And at first I tried to ignore it, laughing off her tiny complaints about my lawn or the color of my curtains, thinking she was just an overzealous neighbor who wanted everything to look like a magazine cover. But soon the laughter faded, replaced with unease, because her attention wasn't casual or fleeting. It was precise, deliberate. The way she would stand at her window staring at my house as if calculating every imperfection. And I noticed her subtle comments to other neighbors, stories twisted in ways that made me seem careless or disrespectful, little things that were easy to brush off but left me feeling exposed, as if I was being watched in every moment I spent on my porch. And it wasn't just the staring that unnerved me. It was the control she seemed to crave, the obsession with rules that went far beyond HOA bylaws, the way she reminded everyone about trash can placement, the angle of garden hoses, the number of leaves on the lawn, and while most of it seemed petty, there was something in the intensity of her gaze that made me believe she would go further if given the chance. And that belief became a quiet knot of tension in my chest that I carried with me day and night, because I had never encountered someone who could make ordinary life feel like walking a tightrope. And the first time I realized her power, it was a small incident, almost laughable in hindsight. She had flagged my garbage cans for being too far from the curb, a violation that was technically true but so minor that no one else noticed, and the way she reported it, with precision and a kind of satisfaction, made it clear she didn't just follow rules, she weaponized them. And then the letters started, polite in tone but sharp with warning. Reminders about weeds, driveway cracks, even the timing of my morning coffee on the patio. And I found myself triple-checking every detail, feeling my own home transform from a place of comfort into a stage where every action was under surveillance. And the neighbors, who once waved and chatted over fences, now seemed hesitant, eyes darting toward Karen's house, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear, and it became impossible to ignore the tension she created. A constant pressure that made even mundane chores feel like walking through a field of hidden landmines. And I remember one afternoon vividly, sitting in the sun on my porch, coffee in hand, when I noticed her across the street, clipboard in hand, measuring the distance of my mailbox from the curb, nodding as if approving her own calculations, and I felt a surge of anger that I couldn't express, because any direct confrontation seemed dangerous, like poking a wasp nest with bare hands. And the more I watched her, the more I realized that her obsession wasn't with rules or order. It was with me, my house, my presence, and that realization made my heart race in a way that was impossible to ignore. And even though I told myself I was imagining things, the small acts piled up into a pattern that was undeniable. The way she would arrive unannounced at neighborhood meetings, her questions sharp and accusatory, the way she would smile at other neighbors while giving me a look that chilled me to the bone. And it wasn't just about control, it was about dominance, about making me feel that no matter how careful I was never safe. And I found myself replaying every encounter, every glance, wondering how far she might go, because fear had a way of magnifying everything. And by the time the first warning signs appeared in earnest, it was already too late, and I can still remember that night as if it were yesterday, sitting on my couch, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, when I smelled smoke, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin prickle and my stomach knot. And at first I thought it was nothing, maybe a neighbor burning leaves, maybe a kitchen accident that hadn't reached me yet. But then the smell grew stronger, acrid and real, and instinct took over, and I ran to the windows to find orange flames licking the edge of my backyard, shadows dancing violently across the walls of my home. And in that moment the world shrank to nothing but fire, panic, and disbelief. And while the fire department rushed in, sirens screaming in the night, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't an accident, that someone had done this on purpose, someone who had waited, watched, and chosen the perfect moment to strike. And as the flames consumed parts of my home, memories and treasures I had collected over years reduced to ash and smoke, the only thought in my mind was Karen, the woman whose obsession with rules and control had escalated beyond imagination. And I knew that this fire was just the beginning, the spark of something far larger and far more dangerous than I could have ever anticipated. And even as the firefighters worked frantically to contain the blaze, I felt a chill, a certainty that the next encounter with her would be unavoidable, that the calm, polite facade she wore was only a mask hiding a person who could ruin lives without hesitation. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to myself that I would uncover the truth, expose her, and reclaim the peace she had shattered. But I also knew it wouldn't be simple, because Karen thrived on tension, on fear, on control, and the war between her obsession and my will had just begun. And the neighborhood that once felt safe was now a battleground. My life forever altered by a woman who had decided that my house, my sanctuary, and my sense of security were hers to destroy, and the memory of the smoke, the heat, and the overwhelming feeling of helplessness burned into me in a way that would follow me through every sleepless night that came after, leaving me both terrified and determined, knowing that what came next would test every ounce of courage I had after the fire. The house I had loved for so long was nothing more than charred wood and smoke-stained walls, and every time I walked past the ruins, I felt a sharp ache in my chest that no one could see, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not an accident, that someone had deliberately crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and that someone was Karen, the woman who had made my life a series of small nightmares long before the flames arrived. And as I tried to piece together what had happened, I realized that living in the aftermath of the fire was just as terrifying as the fire itself, because every phone call, every letter from the HO, every conversation with neighbors carried an unspoken question. What would she do next, and could anyone stop her? And I became obsessed with tracing her movements, memorizing when she left for work, when she walked her dog, even the way she peeked through her blinds to watch the street, because every small detail felt like a clue, and I couldn't ignore the nagging certainty that she had planned this carefully, timing the fire to happen late at night when the street was quiet and the wind would help the flames spread. And the more I thought about it, the more vivid the image became of her standing therein. The dark, a shadow in the yard, her expression hidden but her intention unmistakable. And that thought alone made my skin crawl, because it wasn't just property she wanted to control. It was me, my life, my sense of safety, and for days I couldn't sleep, pacing my temporary apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of that night over and over in my mind, imagining the fire creeping through my walls, consuming everything I had worked for, and thinking about how close I had come to losing more than just material possessions. And yet I also felt a growing need to fight back, to prove that I would not be intimidated by a neighbor who had decided her obsession justified destruction. And the first step was gathering evidence, so I reached out to the fire department, asking every question, poring over their reports, cross-checking timelines, noting inconsistencies, and every time I looked at the report, I noticed details that pointed to human interference rather than an accident, the kind of subtle manipulations that only someone with intent could execute. And then I spoke to neighbors, some of whom had been hesitant at first, wary of Karen's influence, but slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to share what they had seen, small observations that at first seemed insignificant, like her lingering near my backyard late in the afternoon, the way she would carry unusual tools or containers, or how she asked oddly specific questions about when I would be home, and I began to connect the dots, realizing that her obsession with rules had been a cover, a way to position herself to watch, to control, and ultimately, to act without suspicion. And every discovery fueled both my fear and my determination, because knowing what she had done didn't make me feel safe. It made me realize how carefully she had orchestrated every move, and I couldn't ignore the growing dread that she might strike again if I didn't confront her in some way. And even though I knew the law could protect me, I also understood that evidence and witnesses could only go so far if she was clever enough to manipulate perception and charm those around her. And so I spent hours reviewing the security footage from my backyard, the grainy night vision capturing movement in ways that were difficult to interpret. But there was one frame, faint but clear enough to make my heart stop, showing a figure bending near the shed just moments before the flames erupted, a figure whose posture and silhouette were unmistakably Karen. And when I showed it to my lawyer, he agreed that it was strong enough to build a case. But he also warned me that confronting her directly could provoke her, and the thought of facing the woman who had burned down my home filled me with a mixture of rage and fear that was almost unbearable. And while I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, returning to my temporary apartment each evening, going through the motions of work and errands, every shadow outside my window, every sound of footsteps on the pavement made my pulse quicken, because I knew she was watching, waiting, and her control over the neighborhood gave her an invisible power that made me feel constantly exposed. And even as I planned my next steps, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of paranoia, because it wasn't just imagination. Small things continued to happen, objects slightly moved, mail missing, doors that I was certain I had locked left ajar, and each incident reminded me that Karen's presence extended beyond the obvious, infiltrating my life in ways that I hadn't realized were possible, and the neighbors who once smiled at me now looked at me with caution, some even avoiding contact, afraid of the consequences if they displeased her. And it made me feel isolated, angry, and vulnerable, but also more determined than ever to reclaim my sense of security and prove that her obsession with power and control would not triumph over my right to live without fear. And as I reviewed the fire department's report again, looking at the trajectory of the flames, the point of origin, and the surrounding debris, I realized that every detail lined up with my growing suspicion. And while it terrified me to think someone in the neighborhood could commit such an act, it also steeled my resolve, because I couldn't allow fear to paralyze me, and I began compiling every piece of evidence, taking photographs of the damaged property, saving emails and letters, writing down witness statements, anything that would establish a clear record of Karen's actions. And every time I added to the pile, I felt a mixture of dread and empowerment, knowing that while the physical scars of the fire could be repaired, the mental and emotional battle was just beginning. And the question that haunted me day and night was not if I would confront her, but when, because the more I learned about her obsession, the more I realized that waiting too long might give her the chance to escalate further. And yet the idea of facing her in person, seeing that same smile that had always seemed innocent but was now unmistakably sinister, made my stomach churn, and I knew that the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood that had silently witnessed her controlling, manipulative behavior for years. And as I sat in my apartment one night, staring at the darkened skyline, I made a decision, a promise to myself that I would follow the evidence, uncover the truth, and bring her actions into the light, because fear alone could not allow her to continue, and the next steps I took would set the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just justice for my burned house, but the power she held over an entire community. And though I didn't yet know how it would unfold, I felt the first surge of hope amid the fear, because once the truth was revealed, there would be no way for her to hide, and that knowledge, small and fragile as it was, gave me the courage to continue, knowing that the fire had destroyed more than just wood and paint. It had ignited a determination in me that would not be extinguished. And as I prepared to face the days ahead, I understood that every choice, every step, and every bit of evidence I collected brought me closer to confronting Karen and finally reclaiming control over my life and my home. A battle that had already begun in the shadows but was destined to reach the light in the days that followed. The tension in the neighborhood became almost unbearable. Every glance from a passerby felt loaded with judgment or fear, and I realized that Karen's presence had transformed the entire street into a minefield where every word, every action, every casual smile could be twisted into something threatening. And while I continued to gather evidence, I began to notice things I hadn't before, small inconsistencies that hinted she had been manipulating events long before the fire. The way packages went missing only when she was around, how minor disputes seemed to escalate immediately after she intervened. And even more disturbing, I started receiving notes slipped under my door, polite in tone but vaguely threatening, reminding me to follow the rules and stay in my place. And though no one could prove they were hers, I had no doubt, because her obsession with control had clearly extended beyond simple HOA complaints. And as I walked past her house one afternoon, I saw her standing at the window watching me, clipboard in hand, and I caught a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the same cold precision I had seen the night of the fire, and that flicker ignited a fear deep inside me that made every nerve in my body tense, because it was clear that she derived some pleasure from knowing she had disrupted my life. And in that moment I understood that this was no longer just about property or rules, it was about her personal vendetta, an unspoken need to assert dominance over anyone who dared to live independently, and I knew I had to act before she could escalate further. Yet every plan I considered seemed dangerous, because confronting her directly might provoke her, and ignoring her would only let the tension fester. So I turned to my neighbors, seeking allies who might help me understand the extent of her behavior, and slowly, cautiously, people began to open up, revealing experiences they had kept private out of fear, stories of her intimidation, manipulation, and threats disguised as concern. And the more I learned, the more the pattern emerged, a calculated campaign of control and fear that had been going on longer than I realized, and the pieces of the puzzle began to coalesce into a picture far more sinister than I had imagined, a web of obsession and influence that reached into every corner of the community. And it was in those conversations that I discovered the most chilling detail, that Karen had a history of escalating conflicts when she felt challenged, that she would go to extreme lengths to punish those who defied her. And suddenly the fire wasn't an isolated act of anger, it was a warning, a message meant to show that she could, and would, control the consequences of every perceived slight. And, knowing that turned my fear into a mix of dread and determination, because if I hesitated now, the next act could be far worse, and the thought of what she might do next kept me awake at night, pacing the small apartment I had retreated to while my house was being rebuilt, replaying every encounter, every moment, every detail, and imagining the possibilities of her next move. And then came the break I didn't know I was waiting for. A neighbor who had been silent until that point, a woman whose porch overlooked Karen's backyard, approached me cautiously one evening, her voice low and urgent as she described seeing Karen carrying something heavy in the dead of night, moving with purpose toward the edge of the property line. And though she had been afraid to intervene, her story confirmed what I had feared, that Karen's obsession had crossed boundaries no one had imagined. And in that moment, adrenaline surged through me, sharp and raw, and I realized I could no longer wait for her to slip up, that action had to be taken, evidence gathered meticulously, witnesses identified, every scrap of information documented. Because the next encounter might not be just intimidation or small damage, it could be personal, and I couldn't allow it to escalate further. And in the following days, I took risks I had avoided before, checking hidden corners of my property, setting up discreet cameras, timing routines, and recording everything with painstaking care. And each discovery revealed more about her behavior, the deliberate timing of her appearances, the subtle manipulations of neighbors, the careful planning that went into ensuring she appeared innocent while sowing chaos. And with every piece of evidence, my sense of both fear and empowerment grew, because while she had the audacity to commit acts that endangered lives, I now had the proof to confront her in a way that couldn't be dismissed. And yet the emotional toll was immense. Sleepless nights, constant anxiety, the sense that at any moment she might escalate, the gnawing thought that she knew I was watching, that she was aware of my growing awareness, and that awareness might provoke her into something even more dangerous. And it was during one particularly tense afternoon that the conflict reached a new level. As I watched her through a camera lens from my apartment, she moved in a way that was deliberate, almost performative, walking across her lawn, adjusting objects, glancing at windows, and then stopping to stare directly at mine. And though I couldn't see her face clearly, the intent in that posture was undeniable, and my stomach sank as I realized that she had noticed my surveillance, and that recognition carried a silent challenge, a warning that she would not be intimidated, that she was fully aware of my efforts to document her. And yet that very act, while terrifying, galvanized me, because it confirmed that I had an effect, that my actions mattered, and that I could force a confrontation that might finally expose her. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, I knew that the next days would be critical, that every step I took had to be calculated, because one wrong move could provoke her beyond what I could anticipate. And I felt the weight of both fear and responsibility, the knowledge that this was no longer about property. It was about my life, my dignity, and the safety of everyone around her. And I resolved to stay vigilant, to continue documenting, questioning neighbors, analyzing patterns, and preparing for the inevitable showdown, knowing that Karen's obsession was personal, dangerous, and escalating, and that my only chance to survive the next chapter of this nightmare was to remain one step ahead, ready to reveal the truth before she could strike again. And that thought, sharp and electrifying, burned in me with every heartbeat as the night closed in, quiet but tense, the kind of quiet that feels like a prelude to a storm. And I understood in that instant that the conflict between her and me had entered a new phase, one where fear and courage collided, where evidence and strategy were my only weapons, and where the next move could change everything. And I steeled myself for what was to come, knowing that the battle had only deepened, that the stakes were higher than ever, and that the woman who had destroyed my home was now fully aware that I was watching, waiting, and ready to fight back. The moment of turning came when I least expected it, on a rainy afternoon when the neighborhood felt empty and the streets glistened with water reflecting the gray sky, and I was reviewing my growing collection of evidence, trying to piece together a timeline that would finally hold up against her manipulations, when a knock at my temporary apartment door made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest because at this point every sound, every movement outside felt loaded with potential danger, and when I opened the door, I was stunned to see a young woman I barely knew, someone who lived a few houses down and had always been quiet, nervous about Karen like the rest of us, clutching a small envelope in her trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously as if she expected someone to appear at any moment to stop her. And she whispered that she had something that could prove everything, that she had been afraid to come forward because Karen had made her feel trapped, manipulated, and watched, and my pulse quickened as I took the envelope, my hands shaking as I opened it to find a series of photos and notes, timestamps included, documenting Karen's movements in ways I had only suspected, showing her at the edge of my property with a container that looked suspiciously like accelerant, showing her returning to her house, wiping her hands, her expression calm, almost smug, and in that instant a cold clarity hit me. The fire had been planned, deliberate, a message and a punishment rolled into one, and the weight of that truth pressed down on me so heavily that I could barely breathe because it wasn't just about property. It was about the audacity of someone willing to destroy my life while pretending innocence. And the young woman explained that she had hesitated because Karen had intimidated her for months, leaving notes, making comments, twisting conversations so that anyone who challenged her seemed unreasonable or paranoid. And now that she had seen the devastation in my eyes, she had finally found courage to come forward. And as I examined the photos, comparing them to the security footage I had already collected, I realized the evidence was irrefutable. And for the first time since the fire, a flicker of hope mingled with the fear, because while Karen was dangerous, she had also left traces that could no longer be hidden or dismissed, and I felt a surge of determination, knowing that I now had the ammunition to confront her actions legally and publicly, but at the same time a sense of dread settled over me, because revealing her meant she would know, and someone with her obsession and need for control would not respond quietly. She would escalate. She would fight back in ways I couldn't predict, and the thought of facing her in court, of sitting across from the woman who had destroyed my sanctuary, filled me with equal parts fear and resolve, and in the following hours, I pored over every detail, compiling everything into a file that my lawyer could present, checking dates, times, locations, and cross-referencing witness statements, realizing that this turning point was fragile, that one misstep could give her an opportunity to manipulate the story, and yet the very act of gathering the evidence made me feel a strange empowerment, a sense that I was finally reclaiming control over the chaos she had imposed on my life. And then came the shock that pushed the tension to an almost unbearable level. A call from another neighbor, someone who had stayed quiet until now, who whispered urgently that Karen had been asking questions about my routines, about who had access to my cameras, and that she seemed aware that someone had broken through her veil of invisibility. And in that moment the stakes became terrifyingly clear, that while I now had proof, Karen was watching, calculating, planning her next move, and that knowledge made every heartbeat echo like a warning. Yet it also cemented my resolve, because if I hesitated, if I second-guessed, she could strike again, and I refused to let fear dictate my actions. And the next day, as I met with my lawyer to review the evidence, my hands were steady but my mind raced, imagining the moment when Karen would finally be confronted, picturing her expression, the way she would try to twist the narrative, the effort she would put into maintaining the mask of innocence, and I knew that nothing would stop her from trying to manipulate the outcome. But I also knew that this turning point was mine, that with this evidence I had finally shifted the balance, and that gave me a sense of both power and terror that pulsed through me like electricity. And as we prepared the case, carefully strategizing the presentation of evidence, the witnesses to call, and the timeline to establish, I realized that the story was no longer just about the fire. It was about exposing a pattern of obsession and control that Karen had cultivated for years, a web of intimidation and manipulation that affected everyone who lived in the shadow of her authority. And the thought of unveiling that in court, of seeing the reactions of those who had once feared her, filled me with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, because this was no longer just a personal battle, It was a public reckoning, and the emotional weight of knowing that the confrontation was inevitable pressed down on me. My stomach twisting as I imagined her walking into the courtroom, her confidence and smile intact, ready to challenge every accusation, and yet I felt ready, strengthened by the evidence, by the courage of those who had come forward, by the knowledge that the truth was finally within reach. And as I left the meeting that evening, holding the files close, I realized that this was the turning point I had been waiting for. The moment when fear and uncertainty transformed into action, when the scales could finally tip in favor of justice, and though the path ahead was fraught with tension, unknown reactions, and potential danger, I also felt a sense of clarity, knowing that once the evidence was presented, there would be no hiding, no excuses, no further manipulation. And that thought, heavy and powerful, coursed through me, carrying both the weight of what had been lost and the fierce determination to see it resolved. And in the quiet of my apartment that night, staring at the darkened skyline, I felt the first true spark of hope, mingled with the awareness that Karen was out there, aware, calculating, and dangerous, and that the next encounter would be the most intense yet, the one that could change everything. And I understood with a chilling certainty that the fire had been only the beginning, and the real battle was just about to begin, and I was ready to face it, armed with truth, courage, and the unshakable determination to reclaim my life. The day of the court hearing arrived with a weight that pressed down on me like a physical force, every step toward the courthouse feeling heavier than the last, my stomach a tight knot of anxiety and anticipation, and when I entered the building, the fluorescent lights and sterile walls did nothing to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me, because I knew that today was the moment everything I had feared and prepared for would collide. And when I saw Karen sitting at the defendant's table, perfectly composed, her polished appearance and serene smile hiding the chaos she had caused, my chest tightened, every nerve alert, my mind replaying every firelit night, every threatening glance, every moment she had made me feel powerless. And I realized that this confrontation was no longer about rules or property. It was about survival, about proving that she could not manipulate or intimidate me or anyone else. And as the judge called the court to order, a hush fell over the room, neighbors and witnesses in attendance, some avoiding her gaze, some unable to contain their curiosity. And I felt the first tremors of fear mixed with determination, because the evidence I had gathered, though overwhelming, would be scrutinized, challenged, and twisted, and Karen would fight with every ounce of cunning she possessed. But I reminded myself that truth, finally, was on my side, and the proceedings began. With the fire department investigator recounting the timeline, the origin of the blaze, and the unusual signs of accelerant, and I watched as Karen's expression flickered ever so slightly, a micro-reaction that I had studied countless times in the surveillance footage, and it gave me a quiet, grim satisfaction, because it was clear that even she could not dismiss the facts entirely. And then witnesses took the stand, neighbors who had once been silent now bravely describing her obsessive behavior, the notes, the surveillance of homes, the intimidation, and each testimony built a picture of a woman whose need for control had escalated into destruction. And as the evidence was presented, the envelope of photos, the security footage, timestamps, and meticulous records, I felt a sense of vindication that was almost overwhelming, yet still tempered by anxiety, because Karen was clever, practiced, and I knew she would attempt to cast doubt, to manipulate perception. And when her lawyer began the cross-examination, twisting words, questioning motives, and suggesting alternative explanations, I felt my heart race, remembering the nights of fear, the sleepless hours reviewing evidence, and I understood that this was the peak, the point where everything hung in the balance. And then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, something happened that took my breath away. A figure I hadn't expected appeared in court, a cousin of Karen's who had previously been silent, stepping forward to testify with an unflinching voice, revealing details about Karen's obsession, her planning of the fire, and the deliberate steps she had taken to cover her tracks. And in that moment, I watched Karen's confident mask crack, her eyes widening, jaw tightening, a fleeting flicker of panic crossing her face, and I felt a surge of relief mixed with adrenaline, knowing that the truth had finally pierced her facade, that the evidence and testimony were impossible to deny. And as the judge listened carefully, reviewing each piece of proof, the weight of the past weeks, months, and the firelit nights seemed to converge, and the room felt electric, a tangible tension vibrating in the air, neighbors leaning forward, watching every reaction, and I realized that this confrontation was not just mine. It was a reckoning for everyone who had been intimidated, manipulated, or silenced by her actions, and when the final arguments were made, my lawyer speaking calmly, methodically laying out the timeline, the proof, and the pattern of behavior that led to the fire, I felt a calm determination settle over me, a stark contrast to the fear and anxiety that had dominated until now, and Karen, for all her confidence, could no longer maintain the illusion, her smirk faltering, her gaze shifting nervously as the weight of evidence pressed in, and when the judge finally announced that she would be held responsible for the fire, ordered restitution, and imposed penalties for her actions, a flood of relief, exhaustion, and triumph washed over me, my chest tightening, tears welling in my eyes as the tension I had carried for so long finally released, and as I left the courtroom later that day, surrounded by neighbors who offered quiet congratulations, some nodding with relief, others unable to contain their astonishment, I felt the streets of my neighborhood, once heavy with fear, begin to lighten, the invisible weight Karen had imposed slowly lifting, and though the memory of the fire and her obsession would never fully fade, I realized that I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my sense of safety, and that realization, sharp and empowering, gave me strength, because the battle had been long, terrifying, and deeply personal. Yet I had endured, and in surviving, I had proven that truth, courage, and persistence could overcome even the most calculated attempts to destroy, and as I walked past the charred remains of my house, imagining how it would one day be rebuilt, I felt a sense of closure mingled with cautious hope, knowing that while Karen had sought to dominate and intimidate, the law, witnesses, and the courage of those who had come forward had finally restored balance, and in that quiet, reflective moment, standing amidst the evidence of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed, I understood that the climax of this nightmare had passed, but the lessons it left, the vigilance, the courage, the determination to fight back, would stay with me forever, shaping how I moved forward, and as the sun set, casting warm light over the neighborhood, I felt a fragile peace, knowing that justice had been served, that the power she had wielded through fear had been stripped away, and that I had emerged stronger, resolute, and ready to rebuild not just my house, but the sense of security and control she had tried to steal from me. A victory hard-earned, emotional, and cinematic, leaving me with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and the fierce, unshakable certainty that even in the face of obsession and destruction, courage and truth could prevail. In the weeks that followed the courtroom victory, a strange mix of relief and lingering tension settled over my life, because while Karen had been held accountable, the shadow she had cast over the neighborhood and over my sense of security didn't vanish immediately, and I spent the first few days after the ruling walking through what remained of my property, observing the charred walls, scorched earth, and twisted remnants of what had once been a home filled with memories, feeling a heavy ache for everything that had been lost, yet also a spark of hope as I imagined what it could become, the possibility of rebuilding not just a structure but a sanctuary that reflected resilience rather than fear. And while the legal battle had ended, the personal work of reclaiming peace and confidence was only beginning, and I found myself slowly reconnecting with neighbors who had once kept their distance out of fear, sharing conversations that were tentative at first, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what we had all endured, and yet gradually, those connections deepened. A subtle but profound reminder that community could survive even in the presence of obsession and cruelty. And I also began reflecting on how much this ordeal had changed me, forcing me to recognize my own strength, patience, and resourcefulness, the way I had endured fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and emerged not only intact but stronger. And though the nights still carried echoes of the smoke and flames, those memories no longer had the same paralyzing power, replaced instead with a cautious courage that allowed me to face each day without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. And as I coordinated with contractors and friends to restore my home, I felt a sense of agency and control that I hadn't realized I had lost, appreciating each small step forward, each nail driven, each wall painted, each garden planted, as symbolic acts of reclaiming both physical space and personal peace. And it wasn't just about rebuilding a house, but about reconstructing the sense of safety, dignity, and normalcy that had been stolen, And in doing so, I noticed subtle shifts in the people around me. Neighbors who once cowered under Karen's influence now walking taller, speaking more freely, smiling again. Small signs of liberation that were deeply satisfying, because they reminded me that courage could be contagious, that standing up to one person's obsession could ripple through an entire community. And amidst this process, I also discovered something profound about forgiveness and boundaries, realizing that while Karen's actions were unforgivable, the energy I spent dwelling on anger or fear could be redirected toward rebuilding, toward nurturing the life I wanted to live. And it was in those moments of reflection, painting walls or planting flowers, that I began to feel a sense of closure, the fire of the past slowly cooling into something I could acknowledge without pain. And even Karen herself became, in a strange way, a benchmark for strength, a reminder that the human will could be twisted by obsession, yet also that it could be overcome when truth and courage aligned. And as I walked through my restored garden one evening, watching the sun set and the light spill across freshly laid paths and blooming flowers, I felt a quiet, cinematic satisfaction, knowing that this space, once threatened by destruction, now stood as a testament to resilience, patience, and persistence. And I thought about the neighbors who had finally spoken up, the young woman who had come forward with the envelope, the witnesses who had braved their fear to testify, and I realized that this story was bigger than just one house or one conflict. It was about the power of collective courage, about the way truth can dismantle even the most carefully constructed facades. And as I sipped a cup of tea on the porch, the scent of flowers mingling with the crisp evening air, I understood that life could carry scars yet still hold beauty, that fear could be transformed into vigilance, and that trauma could be reshaped into wisdom and strength. And I reflected on my own journey. The night spent anxious and sleepless, the firelit panic, the painstaking collection of evidence, and the courtroom showdown that had demanded every ounce of courage I possessed. And I realized that I had been tested in ways I could never have imagined, and yet I had emerged with not only a restored home but a renewed sense of self, a deeper understanding of human complexity, and an appreciation for the fragility and strength that coexist in our lives. And even as life returned to a calmer rhythm, I found that the experience had left me more attuned to subtle shifts in my surroundings, more compassionate toward those who had endured fear in silence, and more determined to protect both my home and the peace of my community. And as the first evening lights flickered on, illuminating paths, fences, and freshly painted walls, I felt a profound gratitude, not just for the restoration of my property, but for the reclamation of dignity, the validation of truth, and the reminder that even when someone tries to dominate, intimidate, or destroy, perseverance, courage, and the support of those willing to speak up can restore balance. And as I closed the door to my rebuilt home that night, the warmth of light and the quiet hum of life surrounding me, I allowed myself a long, deep breath, savoring the moment, knowing that while scars remain, both visible and hidden, the story had reached a resolution, a cinematic and emotional conclusion that honored the journey. The pain endured, the courage shown, and the strength rediscovered, leaving me with the quiet, unwavering certainty that though fear and obsession had visited my life, they no longer held dominion, and that realization, heavy, complete, and deeply satisfying, carried me into the night with hope, peace, and a profound sense of reclaiming not just a house, but a life fully my own. Months passed after the courtroom verdict, and life began to settle into a rhythm that felt both strange and comforting, the tension that had defined every moment of my days finally loosening its grip. Yet I carried with me the imprint of everything that had happened, the fire, the threats, the fear, and the battles fought not just in court but within my own mind. And as I walked through my restored home, now filled with sunlight, fresh paint, and the scent of new beginnings mingling with the flowers in the garden, I realized how profoundly the experience had reshaped me, teaching me lessons I could never have learned in ordinary circumstances, the way I had learned to observe with precision, to trust my instincts, to fight for truth and justice even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And I noticed how my relationships with neighbors had transformed, conversations once hesitant now flowing with honesty and support, bonds strengthened by the shared relief of surviving the shadow Karen had cast over all of us. And I felt a deep gratitude for those who had found courage, for the witnesses who had spoken up, and for the small acts of bravery that had built the chain of events leading to accountability. And in these reflections I also confronted the more personal, emotional aftermath, the way fear had touched me, the moments of doubt, the nights when sleep was impossible because my mind replayed the fire or imagined her calculating steps outside my window, and I understood that healing was ongoing, that courage was not a one-time act but a series of choices made each day to reclaim space, trust, and peace. And, as I poured that awareness into small daily rituals, arranging furniture, tending the garden, walking the streets with a quiet confidence I had never possessed before, I felt the cumulative weight of my journey transform into strength, a steady, grounded strength that came from enduring, observing, and acting, and even in moments when memories of Karen's obsession flickered in my mind, I found a calm recognition rather than panic, an understanding that the past shaped me but no longer defined my present. And in the community, I noticed subtle but profound changes, neighbors taking care of each other, conversations about rules and fairness replaced by mutual respect, a shared sense that we had survived an ordeal together, and that collective resilience became a quiet but powerful force in our lives, reinforcing the lesson that fear and manipulation could be overcome when truth, courage, and solidarity aligned. And on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch with the sky painted in soft pastels, I reflected on how fragile life can be, how quickly control can be threatened, yet how deeply people can rise to protect themselves and those around them. And in those reflections, I discovered a new compassion, not just for myself but for anyone trapped in fear, for anyone whose boundaries had been violated, and a renewed commitment to vigilance, not paranoia, a balance of awareness and trust, because the ordeal had taught me that courage was rooted in knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to act even when the outcome was uncertain. And I found myself writing notes to friends and neighbors, encouraging them to document concerns, speak up, and never assume silence equals safety, understanding now that power and control can hide behind politeness, smiles, and authority, and that the act of standing up, even quietly, can shift the balance in ways that ripple far beyond the immediate moment. And in this process of rebuilding my life, I also embraced a deeper appreciation for the ordinary, for moments once taken for granted, like laughter over coffee, the gentle rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight on a familiar path, recognizing that life's beauty is magnified when we have faced its fragility. And I realized that part of the lasting impact of the ordeal was the sharpening of my perception, the heightening of my emotional awareness, the understanding that personal boundaries, safety, and dignity are precious and must be fiercely protected. And that lesson extended beyond neighbors and property to every relationship and interaction, guiding me in trust, discernment, and respect. And as the seasons changed, bringing warmth, color, and renewal, I noticed how resilient human spirit can be, how trauma does not erase joy or hope, and how even in the aftermath of chaos, life can unfold with grace and meaning. And I carried this understanding into decisions large and small, from how I navigated relationships, to the way I approached work, to the energy I invested in community, knowing that vigilance and courage must be balanced with patience, empathy, and a willingness to embrace life fully. And as I sat one evening watching the horizon glow with fading sunlight, feeling the soft breeze, hearing the distant laughter of children in yards once tense with fear, I felt a profound sense of closure and continuity, a recognition that the story of fire, fear, and confrontation had transformed into a story of resilience, reclaiming, and hope. And I understood that the lasting message of this journey was that even when a person's obsession threatens to consume everything, truth, courage, and collective action can restore balance, protect life, and illuminate the path forward, and that every scar, visible or invisible, becomes a testament to endurance, teaching lessons that guide future choices, inspire empathy, and cultivate strength. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I felt a deep, cinematic awareness that life's challenges are both trials and teachers, that fear can be conquered, and that even when darkness intrudes, the light of resilience, integrity, and action can restore what was lost and reveal what is most enduring. And I knew that as I moved forward, the fire would remain a part of my story, but it would not define me, that the courage I had discovered, the community I had helped inspire, and the peace I had reclaimed would continue to shape my days, leaving me with a profound, lasting sense that even in the aftermath of destruction, life Strength and hope endure, and that understanding, more than vengeance or fear, is what creates true freedom. A freedom that I would carry with me always. A deep and unshakable knowledge that though chaos may visit, the human spirit, fortified by courage and truth, can rise, rebuild, and shine brighter than ever before.